Well, I'm joined on the podcast now by a friend of mine, a friend of the show, I'm sure in future, Cindy Kent. Hello, Cindy. How are you?
I'm very well, Paul. Thanks for asking.
Oh, thanks for joining us. Now, you're a broadcasting legend in many different ways, aren't you? Because you're a singer, musician, and broadcaster now. The Settlers, that's all part of it, and so many things. I don't know where do you even begin. Where would you begin with your whole broadcasting career? How does it all work for you?
In terms of the career, I guess you're going to go back to 62, probably before you were born, was it, Paul? I'm not quite sure. Near enough. Yeah. Flattery usually helps, doesn't it? So yes, 1962, the group that I was in, the Settlers, as you mentioned, was we entered a talent competition in the Isle of Man. And we formed specifically to do that, which we were very fortunate because we won it. And part of the prize of winning, apart from I think there was some money, though I can't for the life of me remember how much that was an audition with BBC Radio, with BBC Television and a record company. So it was, unlike groups today who have to kind of struggle to get all of those things together, we were very fortunate that it was all in one go. And I remember that our deal was to go on the BBC Radio, and it was I can't remember the name of the programme, but it was done from Birmingham because the group was based in Birmingham. And we had to get to the studios in Birmingham by, let's say something like 7:30 in the evening. So I set off on the bus from where I lived, and the guys who were all in teacher training college near the centre of Birmingham set off as well. But it was the night of the biggest fog I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, the thing about you can't see a hand in front of you, you literally couldn't. So the bus I was on got as far as it possibly could, and then it just turned us all out. I'm like, oh, well, that's great. So being the trooper, I set off walking, along with lots of other people. So it was quite good. The guys did the same thing, carrying a double bass and the guitars and the banjos, and I had to carry myself and my voice. And we got to the studio, and they were so thrilled that we hadn't let them down to record these half a dozen songs, which was a kind of audition, but they booked us anyway, if you know what I mean. So that was my introduction to radio as a performer. And I thought, well, yeah, baptism by fire or by fog, I'm not quite sure which it is.
Well, what are the chances? Actually, on this very episode of the podcast, in fact, what are the chances? We're talking about that when the Birmingham studio of the BBC launched in 1922, it was delayed by a day because of fog.
No.
Because there was a transmitter they're trying to take from London to Birmingham. It was a day late. They couldn't find it because it was all covered in fog. And they eventually found it, and you got the first broadcasters, the first announcers trying to navigate their way through this industrial works to find where this blooming studio is. No one could find it. And here you are as well. So,
what an amazing coincidence.
So all good things start in fog.
40 years later or whatever. I mean, that was great. I mean, in terms of, there's a lovely television studio, which has nothing to do with the BBC, but it's worth telling, is that our introduction to telly was Tyne Tees Television, because Derek Beattie, who was the boss of Tyne Tees Television, was one of the judges, so our audition was with them. And we were scheduled to sing live at the opening and closing of the little local programme. They always do an opt-out, don't they? 20 minutes network, and then this was opt-out. And so we opened it singing Cotton Fields or whatever in this minuscule studio with these funny little cameras on stilts, as it were. And then we ended it singing Blowing in the Wind. And we got out and we got in the car and we drove down to the nearest garage to get some petrol. And the guy said, "Oh, I've just seen you on telly." We thought, "Oh, this is great. This is stardom. This is fame. Isn't it a shame about Kennedy?" And we went, "What?" And while we were singing Blowing in the Wind, literally, Kennedy was shot. So, I mean, everybody knows where they were that day, but we do. I mean, because that was, again, our baptism of doing television. And so, goodness me, fog for radio and a big death for telly. People
amazing.
Didn't want to see us in the future. Keep away. Don't come back.
That's incredible. Wow.
But from that small beginning in Birmingham, we then went on to do loads and loads of radio. I mean, we were on so often, somebody once said they picked us up on their electric razor, because I think partly because we were cheap, but also we were no fuss. We just went in, did the 6 songs or whatever it was we were meant to do, and finished well before the end of the session so we could all go down to the pub. I mean, we were obviously a producer's dream. We did it mostly in one take, except when they decided, yes, let's do some double tracking, which meant you had to do it again. And but we made friends with loads and loads of producers and presenters at the BBC, some of whom I'm still in touch with today. And it's just been a huge part of my career, the BBC. And then I guess the next biggest thing for the Settlers anyway was the last night of a light programme. And I think it was a programme with somebody called Sean, and I can't remember his other name, which is terrible. I ought to remember it. Sean, oh, dreadful.
I'll find it out. I will find out and include it in the podcast. I'm sure we'll find him.
That would be lovely, and I feel terrible for forgetting it. And we'd gone in and recorded, I don't know, 8 or 9 songs or whatever, and the idea was they played them all throughout the show. But they asked us to go in live into the studio and sit around the table with this said man and talk it through with him, because we didn't know what was coming up next. So he'd say, "Okay, you're going to sing for us now," which was all on tape. And we'd go, and so he'd turn the script round and point to whatever it was we were singing. "Oh yes, I know. Let's sing whatever it was." And then we all went across the road to the Speakeasy, which was a bar club quite near the BBC near Oxford Circus, near Broadcasting House. And we had a few drinks there with a load of people. And we stayed up, as I recall, all night to hear the launch of Radio 1 the next morning. And I believe the Settlers were the 12th record to be played, a song called Major to Minor, which Tony Hatch, our producer, had written for us. And I think that was the 12th disc to be played. But it was just this momentous occasion. It was like, wow, this is incredible, because up until then, you know, we knew about pirate radio. Of course, they played all our stuff, which was lovely, and the BBC played stuff that you went in and did. But this was like, oh, Radio 1, wow, this you know, it was history, wasn't it, really?
Was there a sense then of being a sudden or a big build up to this big new launch, of course, because Radios 1, 2, 3, and 4 all at the same time suddenly hit us, really, and it was probably the biggest change the BBC radio ever had.
Well, I think so, yes, and I remember feeling that it was history, you know, even though it was history. You got that sense of something coming to an end and something big starting. And certainly the last thing we did before we left the studio, perhaps I shouldn't tell you this story, but the dear man is dead now, so it doesn't really matter, was Roger Moffat, a wonderful guy, who I subsequently went to work with when I went to Radio Hallen. He was one of the presenters along with me at Radio Hallen in Sheffield. He was reading the weather forecast. And somebody set fire to the bottom of the script. I mean, it sounds very childish, doesn't it? But the script was a huge, great, long thing that had just come off the fax machine, or the whatever. No, it wasn't a fax machine. Whatever the whole thing that came off. And he's reading it down. And some idiot, decided to set fire, because we all smoked in the studio in those days. Goodness me. Set fire to the bottom, and he had to read it as quickly as he could so that he could get it through. I mean, I had visions of Roger, and it's a shame we didn't have cameras that took phones and things, phones that took cameras then, because that would have been a great picture to have kept. But he coped incredibly well. And
well, if they had phones with cameras on, of course, he'd be reading it off a computer anyway, and it'd be far trickier to set fire to it. And you know,
yeah, exactly. No fun. Where's the fun in that, really?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that was great, and then listening to Tony Blackburn, you know, and announcing our record, and you think, oh wow, this is incredible. So I mean, the Beeb has been a big part of my life, because not only did I do stuff with them when I was with the group, but when I left the group, I was asked by the then producer of the Sunday programme, David Winter, whose church I went to see if I'd like to go on the Sunday programme and review new gospel records and things. I mean, some of them, Paul, were awful, and one had to be very careful how one said, well, this isn't quite, you know, whatever. But that was a fun way to get into radio, because I learned how to write scripts, and I, you know, had them thrown back at me if it wasn't good enough, and all of that, and doing all that was great. And then from then I went on to do my own series on Radio 2. I created what is now Good Morning Sunday slot with a program called Gospel Road. I did the first series on my own. I think Cliff Richard joined me on the second series. And then the third series, we toured the country looking for talent. We got people to send us in tapes and demos and Nutshell and people like that. I mean, all sorts of people came to the forefront on that. So yeah, the BBC's been a huge part of my life in so many ways, both as a performer and, of course, as a listener.
And incidentally, Sean Kelly, I found is the name.
Sean Kelly, yes. Oh, I'm so sorry, Sean Kelly. I should have remembered. Well done, you. That's good, Sean Kelly. Yes, of course.
We'll fix that in post, I'm sure. Anyway, it's all fine. So yeah, indeed. Now you're Reverend Cindy Kent. I'll start that again. Now you, as Reverend Cindy Kent, MBE, in fact. For service. I can't even say the words. It's such a mouthful. Cindy Kent is so much easier to say. Reverend Cindy Kent, MBE, Services to Religious Broadcasting, because you have been there not only through the BBC days, but you were the first presenter hired by Premier Radio, I believe. Is that right? So
absolutely.
Launching a radio station.
Yeah, I mean, I was so fortunate to be at the birth of commercial radio, which was fantastic. So my first association with that was LBC in London, where a guy called Nick Page, who excellent broadcaster, who also went on to present programmes on Radio 2, and I co-presented a programme called Sunday Supplement, which ran for about 3 hours, and none of us got paid. It was all volunteer work, but we trained some people who then went on to be the great and the good, people like Julia Bicknell is a name you might know, David Loyne, who went on to be the BBC's whatever, I can remember he was sitting at my kitchen table, and I said, get it off the paper, get the words off the paper, make it live. So that was great. Then I went up to Radio Hallam in Sheffield to do my own radio 3-hour programme every night, which was great fun. Then I came back down to London and worked for Capital Radio. I was their religious affairs producer. And then, as you say, yes, in at the birth of Premier, the guy took me out to lunch and said, what would you like to do? What show would you like? Okay, right, fine. So ended up doing a daily show, and I was with them for goodness knows how many years. In fact, I only left when I took on the church full time, which was 10 years ago. Still gone back and done odd things for them as well, because I'm a great fan of the station, and it's like my baby. You just sort of feel sort of part of it. So yeah, I've been there and done that, and I've probably got all the t-shirts.
It sounds like it. Fascinating as well that you've done the music thing and then firmly gone towards broadcasting and in many different ways. And again, one of the characters we uncovered here, a guy called Rex Palmer, who was a sort of a pop star, if you can call it that, in the 1920s. Who was one of the first to sort of demonstrate this is what radio can do, and he was singing his songs and at the exhibitions. And then very quickly he just fell in love with broadcasting, and he thought, forget the music, I'm going to present and then produce, and ended up running the London radio station in the 20s. So pop music got him into it, and yet suddenly discovered what you can do with broadcasting.
Oh, I mean, I totally go along with that. I'm a huge fan of radio, and I mean, there are so many times on Premier when I was doing shows that you really felt you were in people's lives, and I mean, you don't need pictures, do you? And the pictures are better on radio, as some precocious child once said, and I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I got 9/11. I got the Queen Mother's death. I got Diana's death. In fact, they were worried at Premier when I came in through the doors as to what was going to happen, because every time I went in, there seemed to be some disaster. But it was, again, to get the emails afterwards from people saying, oh, thank you for just bringing all of that into my ears, as it were. I also, over the years, have trained people in radio. And, one of the things you say, and you know this as well as I do, is it's one person listening. That's the beauty of radio, isn't it? It's not you all out there. It's you. Most of us listen on our own, don't we? And so, the knack, if you will. And Terry Wogan had it in spades, didn't he? He was brilliant. He was talking to me. And I know you probably think he was talking to you, but I'm sorry, Paul, he wasn't. He was talking to me. And I felt that whenever I listened to him, and so few broadcasters these days seem to have that intimate knack of talking to me. And I feel Ken Bruce is probably the one around at the moment that's got it mostly, I would say. But it's such a privilege as well, isn't it? It's not a pulpit. You can't, preach. Lots of P's there. It's a privilege to be in somebody's ears and talking to them and taking them by the hand and leading them somewhere. And that's the great. I mean, I'm just, as you can tell, I'm a huge fan of radio.
Well, what Wogan's a farewell speech, I've read a few times and heard a few times, and then you read it back. It's golden, isn't it? It's, thank you for being my friend. I mean, it's just perfect.
He was saying that to me. Literally was saying it. I know he was.
Absolutely.
Well, no, he had that knack, didn't he, where everybody, felt that you were his friend. We were one of Togs or whatever it was, we were all of those things, weren't we? Anyway, good old man, rest in peace.
Absolutely. So any final, what are the big memories for you? What are the standout things in terms of whether it's back in the 60s or 70s, any time ever since, whether you are as a guest of the BBC or indeed behind the microphone hosting your shows yourself? What are the memories that particularly stand out for you?
Well, no one standout really, apart from the kind of ones I've mentioned, I suppose, about the big deaths, which are like, you're live and you've got to cope, and that's when you can't learn those kind of things. Somehow adrenaline gives you the instinct and gives you the wisdom to know what to do. Because if you'd said, the first time it happened was when I was Radio Hallam doing this late night show, and I was on from 10 until 1, 10 at night till 1 in the morning, and the newsreader came in at 10 to do the news, and then he went. And just before 10 o'clock, he sort of said to me, we're just getting reports that Elvis has died. Really? And there were lots of jokes at the time about it. So it was like, oh, really? And then he found out it was true. So I said, right, look, do not make the announcement yet. I ran down to the record library, because in those days you played actual records in the studio. Well, that takes you back. And you had to make sure you were on 33 or not 45. I mean, that was a nightmare in itself. And I grabbed almost every Elvis album I could think of, opened the Guinness Book of Records, and just took us through his life story throughout the next 3 hours. And now, if you'd said to me in advance, what would you do if suddenly you're, confronted with this massive thing in broadcast? I wouldn't have known what to do, but somehow or other there was an instinct. And Keith Skews, who was the wonderful boss of Radio Hallam and a tremendous broadcaster, was driving around the town when he heard the news, and he thought, oh, I better go into the studio, and then stopped and listened to what I was doing. I thought, no, it seemed to be okay. That's what I would have done. No greater praise in my book. But it's little things like that where you wouldn't know Diana's death, all the other things. I don't know what I'd do. I wouldn't sit down and write out. I would talk to this person. But I mean, Diana's death, you're talking to people all around the world to get comments, and 9/11, you're finding out people's views on what's going on and how they feel. And it was a privilege, really, in many ways, to be part of those big events. That was the best one, I suppose, was 9/11, when a woman in America was listening to me in London on her computer, I suppose, to the events that were happening. And I got an email from her the next day saying, thank you so much. I couldn't pray. I was just so angry with God at what had happened, that it was lovely that you asked people to pray, and all I had to do was say amen. And I thought, that kind of meant so much, that you just felt you were there for that woman at that time. And even if nobody else appreciated what you'd done, that one woman did. And that was brilliant. So, yeah, it's a great medium, the wires.
Great. Lastly, obviously it's been a very unusual year, 2020. And many of us now, we're home more, I suppose. Things on the TV and radio that we are seeking solace from. Is there anything particular, any great standout shows or broadcasters even, that you think this year has been helpful or encouraging, or just a nice thing to even watch on the telly? We watched a lot of Poirot over the last... ITV3 is our most watched channel of the year in this house, because it's just great and comforting.
You have taken the words out of my mouth. I mean, I was going to try and be really cheesy and think of something you've been in or involved in that I could...
No need.
I do actually love Miranda. I mean, I could watch time and time again, even if I know what she's saying next, I still watch it. But you're right. I found that it's comfort watching as opposed to comfort eating. And I've recorded all these brand new programs, Us, and I won't mention a whole list of them. I think I'll record them all, and they're all sitting there on my machine. And when I've got a downtime to sit and watch something, I really don't want to tackle something new. And I watched Poirot last night, and you come to the end, you press the green button and the next one starts, and it's brilliant. And I think, yeah, this is good. I know it's all going to end well. And, I think that's what it's all about, isn't it? We feel comfort in things we know, like putting on an old comfy pair of slippers as opposed to brand new shoes, but also because we know it ends with the goodies winning and the baddies not. And there's something there, isn't there? Well, at least that's my sort of psychology exam gone for a bit, I suppose. But, it just seems to me that that's what I want in my life, is comfort and a little bit of, I know it's all going to work out in the end, because if you look around you, and living on your own doesn't help, I don't think. I'm a people person. I hate solitude, and it's been purgatory for me, these last few months. I just love the fact that I've had things to do, I've had work to do, I take services at least twice a week, and so, all these things you have to write sermons for, so it's something to keep me motivated and going. Although, as somebody said the other day, now this is the time to write your book. I thought, well, yeah, but that's new. That's something new. So, yes. Yeah, I probably will at some point.
Yeah, I've heard that from a few people. And it's, but then there's pressure on. You suddenly get to the end of the year and go, I've not written that book. Well, I had plans for 5 of them, but never mind. Yeah. Well, thank you for all you've done, broadcasting and contributing to it all over the years for our ears. And here's to the next time you're back behind a microphone.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul.